Hello, everyone watching from home. My name is Parminder Kaur, and I'm a creative producer here at Slamadama Ding Dong. And today I'm going to be interviewing the very talented Ebony Moncrief, who will be our feature in January. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that Ebony and I are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. All right. For those of you who don't know, Ebony Moncrief is an Alabama-born Melbourne-based performance artist, educator, and creative producer. Ebony's practice explores how identity fluctuates over time in relation to place and through discourse using improvisational and butoh movement practices, as well as creative writing as entry points. Her belief that self-knowledge activates empathy within return nurtures a desire to enact community change, drives her to create spaces for others to connect, express, and engage in critical self-inquiry. Okay, that's so beautiful. As a multifaceted creative person, what's one thing you've always been passionate about?
I'd have to say there'd be two things. So I'm going to talk about writing first. So those would be the two things so writing and dancing. So writing as a kid was always a way for me to release and get thoughts out of my head. And I feel like this is a practice that's common for writers. We take to the page because there's something that we're going through, whether consciously or subconsciously. And the words are a vehicle for understanding or a vehicle for allowing all of that clutter, all of this busyness in our minds to kind of settle and calm, because that's when I think about my relationship with words, what started I'd say maybe around the age of 11 is when I try to clock that I found myself returning to writing as a way of processing and letting go and making sense of things. And it's a funny thing because I said the thing about it being a conscious or subconscious act. And this is something that I'll touch on in the set on Tuesday too, about how sometimes we're writing things in a present moment, but our minds have not caught up to the reality of the words that we are writing, if that makes any sense. But you're nodding, so I'm feeling that you're feeling what I'm saying. And it's interesting because I've had this connection to words since I was young, since I was 11, as I mentioned before. But some things happened over the course of the last 5 years that caused me to lean out of that connection. I felt this tie has been severed. So I'm really in the process of the last year, and specifically the last, like more intensely and deeply the last few months, falling in love with words again, and like reigniting this passion, this truth, this thing that I've felt about myself for so long in terms of being a writer coming back into focus. So I have this part of writing that is something that I've always been passionate about. But then there's the flip side of that, and not even flip, I would say they more so, for me, they run parallel because I am quite an introspective person. I think a lot, I write a lot, I release that way, but then dancing allows me to have more of an embodied practice. Dancing allows me to release in a different way without words, connecting more so to self, to expression, to stillness, allowing beats to reverberate and give me, I like to call them dance floor revelations, because I do, when I'm moving, like all of these things happen in my mind and everything just makes sense.
Mm.
And it's funny because I tell people too that dancing is in my DNA. I know a lot of people say that. I'm not a trained dancer. I've taken a lot of workshops, but my mom told me that she met my dad on a dance floor, and she would tell this story. She would say, he came over and he asked me to dance. And back in those days, songs, they weren't like the radio edits that are 3 and 4 minutes. They go on for 10 or 12 minutes. So you really get to know a person. So she would just tell this really beautiful story about movement. So it just makes me feel that I was destined to move and dance and have that be something that was, a massive part of my identity and always has been. I had a friend at a school that I worked at where as a teacher, he said that, someone could bang two pots together and Ebony's going to move. It doesn't really matter what it is. She's going to be dancing. And it's true.
Yeah, and you're inspired by butoh, and that's a Japanese, and that's kind of slower movement. Or
It's a mix. It's not necessarily slow, but I would say that there are, because it can be jolts or these bombs or these moments where you're moving quite quickly, but then there is this sort of, articulation in movement, these really detailed things, is play with, the nuance and the subtle, but then maybe there is something that comes and it's really abrupt and it's really sharp and quick, and you're moving in different ways. But yeah, it's a Japanese dance theater, and I'm new to butoh. I've only started this journey. It would have been, I took my first workshop in October of 2020. Yeah, it was during the lockdown. It was online because someone else in a different dance improvisational workshop mentioned butoh to me. So I was on the lookout for it. And then the lockdowns happened. So I participated. And when we came out of the lockdowns, I did my first face-to-face workshop with Yumi, who is, a butoh, I'd say butoh master. I don't know if she would call herself that, but someone who like shares so much wisdom and kindness and has been a really big help in preparing myself for this slam on Tuesday. So yes, like I said, so I started doing it about a year and a bit ago. So I still feel quite novice because there's so many elements that are at play. It's a bit of theater, it's a bit of dance, it's installation, it's voice, it's so many things that are interacting and counterbalancing one another. And I feel like for me, where I'm sitting with butoh right now, it's about this really big practice of deep listening and allowing for something from within to emerge in a moment and not trying to control it, which I think a lot of art is that way. And this achieves it through movement and, like I said, playing with this idea of light and dark and installation and things like that. But I'm so keen on this journey and to explore and practice under butoh practitioners all over the world. Like if that's what I would be doing right now if I had the funds and was able to do anything, I would just travel around and learn more about butoh. That's where my heart is really being drawn.
I love that. In your
Mm.
creative journey, was there a moment you remember really falling in love with the power of words?
Two things come to mind. So I have an older sister who's 4 years older than me, and she is a writer. I wonder if she would still call herself that now. I hope that that part of her identity resurfaces because as she listens to this, she probably won't know that how much her writing and her having notebooks and having pen and paper in hand all the time really influenced me. I still have books that she gave me when I was younger that are filled with pictures, with quotes, with images, with all of these things that were spurring, creative ideas and really instigating my love for language and my love for words. So a big part of it comes from her and watching her and wanting to emulate and follow what she was doing as you do as a little sister. And she was also on the debate team. And that I think that's really important as well because, it's like falling in love with words through the written word, through, for me, a lot of it came through music, lyrics, and things like that. But then also that verbal articulation of words, the play that you can have when you're having, especially if you think about what debate is, you are put in front of a group. You don't know if you're going to argue the positive or negative of something, but you have to be prepared for anything. You have to be able to retort. So it's this quick thinking, this agility that you have to have when you are verbally sparring or engaging with someone. So I always thought that that was fun. And that kind of also leads into the other thing. I was that kid at school who, whenever we were reading aloud in a circle, I would get so excited. I would count the number of kids in the circle to see when I was, and then count the paragraph that I was going to read because I was hoping it was going to be a really big one so I could just flex the oratory muscles and just because and I have really good English teachers too. Like I'm really lucky that my English teachers made English language learning fun. They made it interesting. They weren't afraid to be silly, and it was just so unbelievably engaging. So a lot of it really started there as well, and that love with words, with reading aloud. I remember reading Julius Caesar in year 10 and Miss Brown, the English teacher, telling me how much she loved the characterizations and the passion that I gave when I read. And that's something that always stuck with me. And I've just always enjoyed public speaking. So I think it makes sense that all of these things led to me being a performance poet and a teacher as well.
Hmm.
because it's quite performative being an educator.
I think so too. When do you feel, well, there's two ways you can take this question. When do you feel most heard, or when do you feel not heard at all?
I would have to say that I feel most heard in poetry circles. And it was something that came is quite a surprise. And this too will be touched on during the set. So I'm not going to give too much right now. But rocking up to these slams, and it was 10 years ago that I went to my first slamla. It was 10 years ago this year. So it's a bit exciting to have this moment of, what do they call it? Full circle moments, I guess we can call it that. But the way I was embraced, the way that people didn't really expect me to do or be anything, and I just offered myself so fully in those spaces, really made me feel seen and heard for the first time in my life, to the point that I didn't even really realize that I wasn't being seen and heard until I experienced what it felt like. And the same thing goes for butoh spaces. Like I did a show last year with a group of what were then strangers, about 23 of us. But now, like, I feel so connected and so bonded to these people, even though a lot of them aren't a part of my, daily life or daily communications, or I don't see them, but there's this kinship. There was something that really happened in that space. And I remember, and I've said this a few times to people, that there was something about walking into that butoh space. And I, just like with the poetry spaces, I didn't need to pretend to be or do anything. Whatever mood I was in, whatever feeling I wanted to outwardly exhibit, whether it was, crawling around the ground, like making animal sounds, because that shit does happen, or just sitting in silence, staring at a wall. It didn't matter. I didn't need to be performative in such a performative space around these people, because I felt so unbelievably safe.
Mm. I love that. Didn't have to be so performative in a performative space. That also makes me think of, are you familiar with the book The Artist Way?
Yeah, hold up. Let me just reach right over. I'm
Um,
working
yeah.
through it
Well,
now.
well, the author in that talks about how artists don't want to, like, the end goal isn't to be famous or have all these accolades. The end goal is just to be heard.
Yes.
That's what you were saying. How has your poetry changed over the years? How do you think it's evolved and become what it is? Because the first time you performed at Slammer was 10 years ago, and that's
Okay.
quite a bit of time.
It's quite a bit of time. It's one of those things that I feel that I shouldn't say any, but this is my thought. Like, I initially was drawn to the page and the stage out of a way, again, to process, to release. So a lot of the poems were like such deep feeling about, just emotional states and things from the past, and working through all of that. And I still touch on those things, but I feel as if there's more of a critique going on. But like, I say that, but even within what I used to write, there was always some sort of universal theme. It would go from the personal to the universal. And I do still feel that that is the same, because a lot of my poetry, I used to call it confessional poetry, because you're really getting insight to me as a person, how I think, how I move in the world, all of these different things. But it also is quite narrative. I am a storyteller at heart. I do like to lace all of these really beautiful words in between, but there's always like some sort of linear or non-linear narrative. And I think, so to answer your question, one of the things that's really changed is the fact that I've gotten into, a lot of braided essays and things like that. So this means that you have multiple narratives or ideas moving across a piece at one time. And I like the idea of playing with time and jumping in time and ideas and things like that, if that makes sense. So it's not this linear way of looking at something, and how can I also put something that's completely abstract within this quite literal story to add some sort of essence that might not be there. and also using butoh and improvisation is the bio says, like entry points into creative writing. I think a lot is held in the body. Like I said, those dance floor revelations allow for words to come out and ideas to be created. So that's a really, really, really big shift of using movement in a more intentional way to create art. And collaborating more, not being afraid to, reveal things and show people and let them see things and open myself up for critique. There's a piece that I'm doing on Tuesday that is with another poet, a friend that I've had for ages. Dear friend Ariel Cottingham is going to be gracing the stage with me. And it's really special because poetry brought us together, but we've never collaborated on anything. And it happened so unbelievably seamlessly. It was in a workshop with Yumi. We did a 2-hour butoh workshop with her on Monday, and we just really unlocked all these gorgeous pathways through movement, through collaboration, and through just saying, I'm going to try this and let's see what happens. So it's more experimenting, more inviting other people into the process. My poetry now also, like I said, involves a lot of movement and is ways to unlock. So those would be the biggest shifts that have happened over the last decade, 10 years.
Yeah. As someone who's so connected to their own body, when you're thinking, do you feel like you're still, or when you're thinking, do you feel like you're pacing back and forth? Or is it a bit of both?
Definitely column A, column B, but I've clocked myself multiple times, literally walking, literally pacing in the apartment, walking, thinking, talking to myself. So yeah, it's because that's the thing too. It's really funny that, especially when you juxtapose those two things, because I am someone who can literally sit in silence for really long, extended periods of time and just wander off. But I think there is something different if I'm actively trying to be creative. There might be a little bit more physical movement in that pacing that I was speaking about.
Mm. When you're, do you have any poets that you really adore, or any poets that really got you into poetry or spoken poetry, or really instilled that love of words and art and craft in you?
Yeah, definitely. And I've when I think about this question, like, so when I was a kid, it's funny because I mentioned how much I love words and how much I love writing. I didn't read heaps as a kid. Like education was something that was really important in my household, but leisure reading wasn't. So I read for school, read for things. So read for like educational purposes and didn't begin reading for pleasure until much later in life. So the reason why I bring this up, because when I think about the first poets that I was exposed to, it definitely came through song lyrics. It came through music. It came through people like Nina Simone, who I would say would be my all-time favorite poet out there, because I remember listening to her as a child, and it's being growing up in Alabama, being someone that was different, and all the things that she would speak about that were racially charged, that really spoke to the experience of a Black person. And she, especially during the time that she grew up, or when she was coming up and performing music, and it just resonated with me, and her voice too, because to me that's just, it's poetry set to music. And those were my entry points. People like her, Erykah Badu is someone I listened to. Lisa Left Eye Lopez from TLC will always be my favorite female lyricist, or maybe just lyricist, period. Legit. Like if you've not, like obviously everybody knows waterfalls and all these things, but like actually go and listen, because I think that she was talking about some shit that other rappers were not talking about at that time. And being a young person, absorbing everything, that made an impact on me, but more in a more traditional sense. The people that I grew up reading and really resonating to, Maya Angelou was someone, because of her backstory, because of how she, again, it's all about writing about the human experience. And I felt so connected to that because I I mean, I am her, she is me. It's that sort of situation. Langston Hughes was another poet during the Harlem Renaissance that came up. And that's another time period that I want to know more about, because it fascinates me, this idea of this led and charged movement of Black artists, writers, poets, all of that is just so fascinating to me. So it's one of those things that hopefully at some point in time, I will have more time to sit and research all these wonderful things that come into our minds, and the list gets longer and longer and longer because, curiosity is a beautiful thing.
It is. Yeah, I love that. That's such a rich and diverse range of people. I love that so much. All right, we're gonna go into our speed round.
Okay.
Favorite season,
Autumn.
favorite sound.
A techno beat sitting around 120 BPM.
Ooh. Uh, favorite book.
Okay, so I'm gonna say favorite book at this moment in time because identity shifts and change. But I'm reading an author called Alexander Shea. He is a Korean American author, and I love the way he writes because it's there's economy of words, and he says so much with so little. And he again like practices this idea of especially specifically in the book How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, this idea of non-linear storytelling. There's these really beautiful vignettes of his life at different moments that are creating this person and this idea of who he is and how he, became a writer essentially. So yes.
I love that. Favorite song.
I shouldn't make these sounds. I have an issue with favorites, but the two songs that popped into my mind, and again they go back. Everything goes back to lyrics. Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Tears for Fears, and Empty by Ray LaMontagne, who also is a favorite poet of mine. New Jersey folk singer, blues songwriter. Yeah.
I love that. Favorite feeling or memory.
When autumn comes around and the leaves, I live in East Melbourne, so it's very green, very lush, so you can really witness the changing of the season. So when autumn comes around and the leaves begin to change on the trees on my street, and the trees and green and foliage in the gardens down the road, there's this feeling that I don't know what I don't know what it is, but it makes me feel like I'm back in Denver, which is a place I lived for 4 years. Maybe it's the colors, the temperatures, I'm not really sure, but I'd always mark it because it's something that's so sensory that comes over my body. So there's a sense of familiarity and peace in this place that's literally on the other side of the world. So that's something that I cherish, and it happens every single year. So that's really nice piece of home to keep with me.
I love that. That's so special. What piece of advice would you give to your younger self or any aspiring creatives?
From yeah to my non well, I guess this is well, it depends on the person, on the creative, but what I would say to little Eb, something I said earlier, ask for help. Ask for help earlier, sooner rather than later. You don't need to do everything by yourself. Resist the urges to retreat, and really, really find solace, comfort, and inspiration through collaboration. Reach out to other artists. This doesn't need to be a solo thing. This is definitely something that was specific to me and my process, but not being afraid to ask for help. And there's such beautiful vulnerability within that because more often than not, people want to help and they want to be there for you. And I think that's a lesson that I wish I would have learned a little bit sooner because things might have been a bit easier.
Yeah, I agree. And also, for one person to win an award, there's like a whole community behind that person. Um, Thank you so much for doing this interview with me, Ebony. So Slammadama Ding Dong will be having a slam next week on the 25th of January at Brunswick Ballroom. And Ebony, have you got anything to plug?
Yes, so there is an International Women's Day gala in conjunction with Mother Tongue. So Mother Tongue is another really beautiful poetry event that happens that's ran by Fleecy Malay, and it's a 10-year anniversary of that event, which is really special because just like Slamma, Fleecy and Mother Tongue have been a part of my creative journey since the very beginning. And it's the 8th of March from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Center in Ivanhoe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ebony. All right. Thank you so much for everyone that's
Thank
watching at
you.
home. Hopefully we'll see you at the Slam on the 24th of Jan at Brunswick Ballroom from 7:30 to 9. All right. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.